All right, let's dive into something pretty interesting today. Buy-to-let investing. It seems like it could be a pretty good way to make some extra cash.
Yeah, definitely some potential there.
But of course, there's always a lot to consider when it comes to, well, any kind of investing, really, and
Yeah.
especially with something like property. So we've been digging through a bunch of articles, places like Zoopla, Money Helper, some of the big banks even.
Right, like NatWest.
Yeah, exactly. NatWest, Barclays, HSBC UK, all weighing in on this whole buy-to-let thing. And our goal today really is to give you all the info you need to figure out, you know, is this something you should even be thinking about? Could this work for you? Now, one of the things that really caught my eye right off the bat, Zoopla mentioned that the average buy-to-let property in the UK is pulling in something like £1,000 a month in rent. I don't know about you, but an extra £1,000 a month sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah, that's not bad at all.
But before we all go rushing out to buy up all the properties,
Yeah.
we gotta look at the whole picture. Like what kinds of properties are they talking about? I mean, is that even realistic for, someone just starting out?
Right, like a first-time landlord.
Exactly. And then what about all those hidden costs everyone's always warning about? So to help us break it all down, we've got our expert here ready to share their insights. So what are your thoughts as we kind of get into this?
Well, it's easy to get focused on the profits,
Sure.
but being a landlord, I mean, that's a big commitment, you know? It's not just like you find a tenant and then you just sit back and collect rent every month. Money Helper actually pointed out this trend of accidental landlords, they called them.
What's that?
People who they inherit a property or move in with a partner,
Right.
and all of a sudden they're managing a rental without really planning for it.
Oh, wow. So they just kind of fall into it.
Exactly, and they're maybe not prepared for all that comes with it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So before we even get into the money side of things, like you really need to ask yourself, am I ready for all the responsibilities that come with being a landlord?
That's such a good point. I mean,
Right.
it's not something to just jump into lightly. But let's take a step back for a second.
Yeah.
For those who are totally new to this,
Mm.
can you just kind of explain the basic idea of buy-to-let?
Yeah, so basically buy to let means you're buying a property specifically to rent it out.
Okay.
The goal is to make money from those monthly rent payments.
Right.
And hopefully the property value goes up over time. It can be a way to, build some wealth, create a source of passive income.
Mhm.
But as I said, it also means you're taking on this role of landlords with all the legal and ethical stuff that goes with it.
Now, Zoopla, they really emphasize that you need a specific type of mortgage for buy-to-let. Why are those different from the mortgages we use to buy our own homes?
Well, it comes down to how the lenders assess the risk.
Ah.
With a regular mortgage for your own home, they're mostly looking at your income and whether you can make the payments. But with buy-to-let, they're more interested in the property itself.
Hmm.
Can this property generate income? That's what they care about.
Interesting.
They want to make sure the rent can cover those mortgage payments, even if there are times when the property is empty.
So it's not enough for me to prove I can pay. The property has to prove it can earn.
Exactly, and that's where it gets interesting.
Right.
Zoopla mentioned that a lot of buy-to-let investors use something called interest-only mortgages.
Interest only.
Yeah, have you heard of those?
I think so, but maybe you can just explain it.
Sure. So with an interest-only mortgage, you're just paying the interest each month,
Okay.
not actually paying off any of the original loan amount.
So obviously that means lower payments each month,
Hmm.
which frees up more cash in the short term, right?
Exactly, but, and this is a big but,
Oh.
you still owe the full amount of that loan at the end of the mortgage term.
Oh, so lower payments now, but maybe a huge bill later on.
Yeah, that's the trade-off.
How do people usually deal with that?
Well, most investors who go with interest only, they're planning to sell the property at the end of that mortgage term and then use the money from the sale to pay off the loan.
Okay, so it depends on the property actually going up in value.
Right. If it doesn't, you could be in a tricky situation.
So there's definitely some risk there. What about those stricter eligibility criteria? Money Helper mentioned those.
Oh, yeah. Lenders, they want to minimize their risk.
Makes sense.
So they usually require a bigger deposit for buy-to-let mortgages.
Bigger than a regular mortgage.
Yeah, often between 25% and 40%.
Wow, that's a lot.
And they also want to see that you're financially stable, good credit score, decent income.
So even though the focus is on the property earning, my own finances still matter?
Oh, absolutely. They want to be sure you can handle the mortgage payments, even if something goes wrong with the rental income.
All right, so let's imagine we've jumped through all those hoops. We've got our buy-to-let mortgage. How do we make sure we're picking a property that will actually be a good investment? What should we be thinking about?
Well, one of the key things to look at is something called rental yield.
Rental yield.
Yeah, it basically tells you how much return you can expect on your investment. It's expressed as a percentage.
Okay, so how do we calculate this magical rental yield? Is it a complicated formula?
No, it's pretty straightforward, actually. You take the annual rental income, divide it by the property value, and then multiply that by 100. Zoopla recommends aiming for at least 5%.
At least 5%, got it.
Of course, higher is always better.
So let's say I buy a flat for £200,000 and rent it out for £1,000 a month. That's $12,000 a year in rent. Divide that by the 200,000, multiply by 100. That gives me a 6% rental yield. Hey, not bad.
Sounds pretty good.
But before I get too excited, we have to remember that rental yield is just one part of the story. Zoopla also warned about all those hidden costs that can really eat into your profits, right? Those pesky costs. We can't just assume that all the rent we collect is pure profit.
No, not at all. You got to factor in expenses like maintenance, insurance, and those times when the property is empty between tenants.
Right, even if no one's living there, those mortgage payments and bills keep coming. Zoopla said to set aside at least £250 a year for maintenance. Is that realistic?
It's a good starting point, but honestly, it's probably smart to budget even more than that.
Okay,
Unexpected repairs can happen, especially as a property gets older.
makes sense.
Having that extra cushion can really save you a lot of stress.
So rental yield gives us a starting point, but we got to be realistic about those hidden costs. And then there's the big T word, taxes. I have a feeling that's a whole other conversation.
Oh yeah, definitely. Understanding the taxes is super important for any buy-to-let investor. We'll dive into all that in part 2 of this deep dive.
Looking forward to it. Okay, so we're back and ready to tackle those buy-to-let taxes. I have to admit, this is the part where I usually start to zone out a little.
Yeah, it can be a bit much.
But we gotta know this stuff, right?
Absolutely. It's crucial before you even think about investing in buy-to-let.
So where do we even begin? Zoopla mentioned a few different types of taxes, but honestly, it all just kind of blurred together for me.
Okay, well, let's start with the most straightforward one, income tax.
Income tax, okay.
So any rent you get from your buy-to-let property that's considered income.
Just like my salary.
Exactly, just like your salary.
Yeah.
And it's taxed based on your tax bracket, same as your regular income.
Oh, so that extra £1,000 a month I'm hoping to make could actually butt me up a tax bracket.
It's possible, yeah, you definitely have to factor that in.
Okay, good point. It's easy to get excited about the total amount without thinking about what you actually get to keep.
Right, always look at the net income, not just the gross.
Got it, net income after taxes. What about when I eventually sell the property? Zoopla mentioned capital gains tax.
Right, capital gains tax or CGT, that applies to any profit you make from selling an asset. And that includes buy-to-let property.
So if I buy a house for, say, £200,000, and then a few years later I sell it for £250,000, I'd have to pay CGT on that £50,000 profit.
Exactly, that's the basic idea. But the good news is there are some allowances and deductions that can reduce how much CGT you owe. For example, everyone has an annual tax-free allowance for capital gains.
Oh, okay, that's good to know.
But the specific rules, they can get pretty complicated.
Yeah, I'm getting that talk to a tax advisor feeling. Anything else besides income tax and CGT that we need to be aware of?
Yes, one more, stamp duty land tax.
Stamp duty, right?
When you buy a buy-to-let property, you pay an extra 3% stamp duty on top of the usual rates.
Ugh. So buy-to-let has its own special tax hurdles. It's definitely not as simple as just collecting the rent. Speaking of complicated, let's not forget all those landlord responsibilities. Zoopla really emphasized that it's not just a passive investment. It comes with some serious obligations to your tenants.
Yeah, for sure. Being a landlord means more than just fixing a leaky faucet every now and then.
So what exactly does that entail? I imagine there were some specific regulations and things like that.
Oh, yeah, definitely. For example, you're legally required to have a gas safety check every year.
A gas safety check, okay.
And it has to be done by a gas-safe registered engineer.
So no cutting corners on that one?
Nope. It's all about making sure the gas appliances and flues are safe and working properly.
What about electrical safety?
Well, in England, there's no legal requirement for regular electrical inspections,
Okay.
but it's definitely best practice to have them done at least every 5 years.
Every 5 years, all right.
It's just about making sure the electrical systems are safe for your tenants.
Sounds like there's a lot to keep track of.
There is, and we haven't even talked about fire safety yet.
Fire safety, right?
You need working smoke alarms on every floor. and carbon monoxide detectors in any room with a solid fuel-burning appliance.
Like a fireplace.
Exactly, like a fireplace or a wood-burning stove.
All essential stuff for keeping tenants safe. It really highlights that being a landlord is a big responsibility. What about energy efficiency? I remember Zoopla mentioned something about an energy performance certificate.
Right, the EPC. You need
Mhm.
one for your rental property, and it has to meet a minimum energy efficiency rating of E
Okay,
before you can legally rent it out.
so it's not just about saving money on energy bills, it's actually a legal requirement.
Exactly, but of course, a higher EPC rating can make your property more appealing to tenants.
Makes sense, especially with energy costs being so high these days.
Right, and it might even let you charge a higher rent.
So being a responsible landlord can actually be good for business.
Absolutely. And then there are more responsibilities when it comes to things like tenancy agreements.
Tenancy agreements, right? And protecting the tenant's deposit. Zoopla explained those government-backed deposit protection schemes. You can't just hold on to the deposit yourself, can you?
No, not anymore. It's a legal requirement to protect it in an approved scheme.
So what's the purpose of that?
It ensures the deposit is held securely and that it can be returned to the tenant at the end of the tenancy.
Unless there are some deductions
Right, there can be deductions for things like unpaid rent or damage to the property.
beyond normal wear and tear
Exactly. So having a detailed inventory at the beginning is really important.
to avoid any disputes.
Exactly. Good documentation is key.
Speaking of documentation, Zoopla also mentioned right-to-rent checks. Do you remember those?
Yeah, it's a legal requirement in England. Landlords have to check that their tenants have the right to rent a property in the UK.
Oh, right. So it's about making sure they're legally allowed to live here.
Exactly. It's about preventing illegal immigration. And it's taken very seriously. Landlords who don't do these checks can face big fines.
Wow, even prison.
In some cases, yeah. It's a crucial part of your responsibility as a landlord.
Okay, so we've got gas safety checks, electrical inspections, fire safety, energy efficiency, deposit protection, right-to-rent checks. Anything else we need to add to this list?
Well, Barclays also mentioned the importance of having the right insurance.
Insurance, of course.
We're not just talking about buildings insurance, which is usually mandatory anyway if you have a mortgage.
Right. You want to protect your investment. What other types of insurance should landlords think about?
Well, contents insurance is important, especially if you're renting out a furnished property.
Furnished. Okay.
It covers the stuff you provide for the tenants, like furniture, appliances, carpets, protects them against damage, theft, fire, that kind of thing.
Makes sense. And I vaguely remember Zoopla mentioning landlord liability insurance.
Oh, yes, that's an important one.
What does that cover?
It protects you if a tenant or a visitor gets injured on your property and decides to sue you.
Oh, wow.
It also covers you if you accidentally damage any of the tenant's belongings.
So it's like an extra layer of protection, just in case.
Exactly. It gives you peace of mind knowing you're covered if something unexpected happens.
So it sounds like being a landlord involves a lot more than just collecting rent checks.
It definitely does. It's not a passive investment. It requires effort and a commitment to your responsibilities.
But let's not forget about the potential rewards.
Of course not. There's a reason people invest in buy-to-let.
It can be a great way to build wealth over the long term, right?
Absolutely. And generate passive income, achieve financial freedom.
Speaking of rewards, let's move on to finding the right property. Zoopla talk about understanding what tenants are looking for. It's not just about what I like, is it?
No, not at all. You have to think like a tenant. What are their needs and priorities?
Okay, like what kind of things?
Location is always huge. Families might want to be near good schools and parks. Young professionals might prefer easy access to transport and the city center.
Right? Different strokes for different folks.
Exactly. Zoopla also mentioned that smaller properties in prime locations can be really attractive to renters.
So it's all about understanding the local market.
For sure, and don't forget about new build properties.
New builds, yeah.
They might cost more upfront, but they often have lower maintenance costs.
And they tend to be more energy efficient. Right?
Exactly, which can be a big plus for tenants these days.
So it's a balancing act, finding something tenants want
Yeah.
that also makes financial sense for me.
It is. And speaking of balancing acts, let's talk about letting agents.
Letting agents, okay?
Zoopla explored whether or not they're worth the cost.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Letting agents can take a big chunk of your rental income. But they also handle a lot of the work involved in managing a property.
It's a trade-off for sure. Letting agents offer different levels of service. Some just find tenants and collect rent. Others fully manage the property, including maintenance and repairs.
So it can be really helpful for busy landlords.
Yeah, especially if you don't have the time, or maybe you don't want to deal with tenants directly. They have the experience to handle tenant issues efficiently.
Zoopla mentioned fees are usually between 10% and 20% of the monthly rent. That can add up.
It can, but it might be worth it for the peace of mind and the time you save.
They also recommended choosing an agent who's a member of a professional organization, like ARLA Property Mark or NALS.
Right. Those organizations have strict standards for their members.
So it's a good sign if your agent is accredited.
Exactly. It gives you some reassurance that they're reputable and qualified.
All right, so let's say we found our perfect rental property, got our mortgage, maybe even hired a letting agent. How do we actually find tenants?
Well, think of it like selling your own home. Presentation is key.
Okay, so make it look good.
Exactly. Clean, well-maintained, good quality photos for your listings.
First impressions matter.
Absolutely. And write clear descriptions that highlight the property's best features. And be responsive to inquiries from potential tenants.
What about those tenant checks that Zoopla mentioned?
Oh, those are essential. Tenant referencing and credit checks are non-negotiable.
So you know who you're renting to.
Exactly. You want to be confident they can afford the rent and that they have a good track record.
It's all about minimizing risk,
Absolutely. And don't forget to consider the type of tenant you're aiming for.
like students versus families.
Exactly. Different tenant types have different needs and different implications for your investment.
Okay, wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. Mortgages, taxes, landlord responsibilities, finding tenants. It's a lot to take in.
It is, but hopefully you're starting to get a good understanding of what buy-to-let really involves.
Before we draw any conclusions, let's zoom out a bit. Zoopla presented a pretty balanced view, highlighting both the potential benefits and the drawbacks of buy-to-let.
Right. It's important to weigh both sides carefully.
So what are the main pros and cons we should be thinking about?
Well, buy-to-let can be a great way to build wealth and create passive income. But it's not a get-rich-quick scheme. It requires work, and you have to be comfortable with the responsibilities.
So it's not just about the numbers, it's also about whether you're cut out to be a landlord.
Exactly. And the market is always changing. Regulations, interest rates, tenant demands, you have to be adaptable.
Sounds like it's a journey, not a destination. As we wrap up this part of the deep dive, what are some key takeaways we should be thinking about?
I think the main point is that buy-to-let can be a rewarding investment. But it's not passive. It takes planning, research, and a willingness to adapt to the market.
So before we move on to the final part of this episode, let me ask you this. Considering everything we've discussed, the money, the responsibilities, the challenges, the rewards, do you think buy-to-let is something you could see yourself doing?
That's a great question. There's no right or wrong answer. It depends on your personal situation, your risk tolerance, your financial goals. Hopefully, this deep dive has given you the information you need to start exploring those questions.
So we've really dug deep into this whole world of buy-to-let investing. We've looked at the money side of things, the legal stuff, and what it actually means to be a landlord. As we wrap things up, let's pull out some of the key takeaways, the things that anyone thinking about buy-to-let should really remember.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things to remember is that buy-to-let is a long game. It's not about flipping properties for a quick profit. It's about building a solid investment that can bring in income for years to come.
HSBC UK made a good point about those interest-only mortgages. You really got to have a plan for how you're going to pay off that loan in the end. What if, property values don't go up like you expect? What are some other ways out of that?
Well, you could think about refinancing, switching to a repayment mortgage, or using savings to cover the loan, maybe even selling part of your portfolio. It's always good to have a backup plan.
Yeah, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And of course, as we talked about earlier, it's not just about the numbers. Being a landlord, that comes with a lot of responsibility.
For sure. NatWest actually had this really handy checklist for landlords covering everything from gas safety certificates to understanding tenancy agreements. It's all about being a responsible property owner and treating your tenants right.
Yeah, and they had some good advice on communication, too. Being responsive to your tenants, fixing problems quickly, maintaining a good relationship, that can make a big difference.
Definitely. Happy tenants are more likely to stay longer, which means fewer empty periods for you.
Makes sense. And then there's the whole research aspect. You really need to understand the local market, what tenants are looking for.
Zoopla really stressed that you got to pick properties that match the demand in your area. Are you renting to students, families, young professionals? Each group has different needs, and that should shape your investment strategy.
So it's about finding those profitable niches, right?
Right. But even with all the planning in the world, there are always risks with buy-to-let.
Like what?
Interest rates can go up, property values can drop, unexpected costs can pop up.
Barclays talked about having a financial cushion for things like that. Empty periods, surprise repairs, that sort of thing.
Exactly, being prepared for the unexpected is key.
So it's a reminder that buy-to-let is like any investment. It has its ups and downs, but it can also be really rewarding.
Absolutely. That potential for passive income, building long-term wealth,
And even leaving a legacy for your family, that's pretty appealing.
and it can give you more control over your financial future.
But both Money Helper and HSBC UK reminded us about the taxes.
Oh, yeah, you can't forget about those.
Buy-to-let has its own set of tax rules.
Staying informed can save you a lot of headaches down the road.
Okay, I think we've hit all the main points. The long-term view, the responsibilities, the risks, and the rewards. Buy-to-let can be a great investment, but it's definitely not passive.
It takes planning, effort, and you got to be willing to handle the challenges that come up.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final question to think about. Considering everything we've discussed, the good and the bad, do you think buy-to-let is the right move for you?
That's the big question, isn't it? Only you can answer that. It all depends on your own situation, your goals, your comfort level with risk.
We've given you the information. Now it's up to you to do some soul searching. And remember, learning never stops. The world of buy-to-let is always changing, so stay curious, keep learning, and don't be afraid to ask for help. A big thank you to our expert for sharing their insights with us today. It's been a fascinating conversation. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful and informative. Remember, knowledge is power. Keep exploring, keep researching, and make smart decisions that will help you achieve your financial goals. Until next time, happy investing.